Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. And on behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online, as well as those of you who are here with us in person tonight. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all of us to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forum Series, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. John Farrell has wonderfully agreed to sign copies of Ted Kennedy, A Life After tonight's program. Our bookstore will be selling copies until 7:45 if you are interested. Before we get started, we'll thank you all for silencing your cell phones. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. When the Q&A starts, we will invite those of you who are joining us in person tonight to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. We are so grateful to have this timely opportunity to explore Senator Kennedy's life and legacy with our distinguished guests, and I'm now honored to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm so delighted to extend a warm welcome back to the Kennedy Library to John A. Farrell, author of the new book, Ted Kennedy, A Life, which was longlisted for the 2022 National Book Award for Nonfiction. His previous books include Richard Nixon, The Life, which won the Penn Jacqueline Bograd Weld Award for Biography, and the New York Historical Society, Barbara and David Zaladznik, sorry about that, book Prize for American History, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2018. Clarence Darrow, Attorney for the Damned, and Tip O'Neill and the Democratic Century. He has also earned a George Polk Award, the Gerald R. Ford Prize, and White House Correspondents Association honors for his coverage of the presidency during a prize-winning career as a journalist, including distinguished service at the Boston Globe. And I'm also so glad to welcome our moderator for this evening, David Nasaw, back to the library. He's the author of The Patriarch, The Remarkable Life and Turbulent Times of Joseph P. Kennedy, which was selected by the New York Times as one of the 10 best books of the year, and a 2013 Pulitzer Prize finalist in biography. Andrew Carnegie, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and recipient of the New York Historical Society's American History Book Prize, and a 2007 Pulitzer Prize finalist in biography, and The Life of William Randolph Hearst, which was awarded the Bancroft Prize for History, and the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize for Nonfiction. He is the past president of the Society of American Historians, and until 2019, he served as the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History at the SUNY Graduate Center, where he is now Distinguished Professor Emeritus. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you. It is a delight to be back here. I spent many hours upstairs doing my research, as I'm sure you did as well.
Absolutely.
And it's a great place to do research. I mean, wonderful archivists, librarians. I've been in many libraries, and this is one of my favorite. I've got to find another Kennedy to do a book about. Let me begin briefly by saying that this is an extraordinary book. It is, historians are not judges. They're not God. It's not our job to say thumbs up, thumbs down, to say angel, devil. if you're going to write a biography of someone, you choose someone who's complicated. If you're going to read a biography, you want to read about someone who is filled with contradictions, with ups and downs, with triumphs and tragedies. And John has chosen to write a biography about a conflicted human being who had his ups and he had his downs. And the ups were to the sky, and the downs, we don't have to, I'm not going to use an analogy here, but they were pretty low. And he's done it with honesty, with fairness. You know, we don't, as historians, get to the truth. We get as close as we can, you know. We spend hours trying to figure out, days, months, years, trying to figure out what we're doing and what is as close to the truth as we can get. You know, and you did it, my friend. So I thank you and I congratulate you. And I urge you all to go get the book. I'm not going to start with the boilerplate questions, which you've been asked a dozen times and I've been asked a dozen times. Why'd you write the book? What's new? Did you find stuff that you didn't expect? Let's
Those are the
start.
questions I prepared for.
Well, sorry. Well, if I run out of other questions, we'll go back to them. Let's get to the heart of the matter. How did this youngest son, who lived a life in which he was both spoiled and neglected at the same time, when you look at the pictures, you see this roly-poly kid with a big smile, almost a clownish smile in the family photos, always up front. How did this kid, who then grew up to be a heartthrob and a Harvard football player and get thrown out of Harvard and have two quotes from your book on page 24? John urged their father to let Ted be a playboy. And 2 pages later on page 26, Ted from the French Riviera writes his father, quote, "Having barrels of fun, send money for more barrels." How did he become the lion of the Senate? I mean, you know, what happens?
It is a story that I did not expect to find. Even though I had covered the senator for the Boston Globe and had a friendly press senator relationship with him, he was such a glad-hander. He was such an amazing personality that you easily could be distracted from the great pain that he suffered in his life. And it wasn't just physical pain, but constant emotional pain throughout his public life. If you think about it, before he even got to the United States Senate, he had had one brother die in a plane crash in war, and a sister die in a plane crash, and another sister be taken away because of a failed lobotomy. And then he gets to the Senate, and he's in his own plane crash. And in that plane crash, he breaks his back, and he can't walk. He has to learn to walk all over again. He lays on his back in a strapped companion like a chicken on a spit, and for 6 months. He learns to walk. He comes back to the Senate, and along the way, he's got 3 children. All 3 of the children develop some form of cancer before early middle age. His wife develops a problem with alcoholism, and his marriage is on the rocks. And then out of in Shakespearean quality, two brothers are assassinated and cut down. Now, any one of those events would have been a defining character for yours or my life. That would have been the moment of our lives. Most of them for Ted Kennedy are almost parenthetical when compared to the shock of the two assassinations. So he has this great personal pain, a great empathy that grows from it. And then I think the other thing that you have to realize is that despite their money, despite their great wealth, despite Joseph Kennedy's power, they still came from Boston. And in Boston, there was still, in Joseph and Rose's childhood, this enmity between the Protestant Brahmins and the Irish-American immigrants. And this feeling fighting for the little guy, fighting for the common man, fighting against the powers that be, being discriminated against because you were Irish, because you were Catholic, came down to even these kids, kids who went to the best orthodontists and the greatest universities, and during the heights of the Depression were eating roast beef on Sundays at the great Manhattan restaurants, whose life would seem to be so far away from those of the common character. But both John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy commented upon it, and so did Ted Kennedy, that they were inoculated with this feeling about the little guy because of the Irish-American discrimination, the known Irish need apply stories that they got from their parents and also from Honey Fitz, their grandfather. And it left them very unique politicians. Politicians from the upper class who felt for the little guy. Charles Daly, who some of the old hands around here may remember, worked for all three of them. And he called them well-fed underdogs with pretty good bite. And that's pretty much the best description as to why the Kennedy brothers became liberals that I've in one sentence that I have found.
Yeah, why did, we're going to jump around here. You'll excuse me for not being chronological. Why did he run? Did he want to run for the Senate? Was he sort of pushed into it? I mean, the story always goes that Joe made Jack run for the presidency, and that's not true. I mean, he encouraged him, he wanted it, but it was Jack who made the decision. What about Ted? Did he want a career in politics?
After Ted graduated from Harvard, his dad called him in and sent him around the country to visit the family business establishments, and he was told that this was a potential course for him. That this was before Steve Smith had entered the family and taken over the business affairs, and so he went out and he saw the oil wells in Tulsa, and he went to Chicago and he saw the Mercantile Mart, and he came back and he told his dad, no, I want to be with Jack and Bob, doing what they're doing, and they were really idols to him. We see that there's a couple of great pictures in this library of the three of them together, smiling, looking handsome, walking out of the surf. But there was a clear distinction between Jack and Bob, who worked together in politics, and Ted, who was the chubby little brother, who the brothers and sisters called biscuits and muffins, and who teased mercilessly as a small child. And he felt it. He felt this great adoration of his brothers, a feeling that he was not in their league, but he chose politics nonetheless, which tells you a little bit about him, which was that even though he did have this sort of a feeling of insufficiency, he still wanted to, that Kennedy competitiveness came through, yeah. And he said, I want to play in the league with Jack and Bob as well.
But was he content? Did he must have known that as long as these two remained alive, he was always going to be the little brother.
He was more than content. He was quite happy being Teddy. He was quite happy being Ted Kennedy and just idolizing these folks. Jackie once said that before the two other brothers died, that, oh my God, Ted at the age of 30 has already achieved the greatest thing he could ever hope for. and that was to be a United States senator. So he was never trained for, he was never prepared for what happened to him. He was supposed to be the jester, and instead the crown falls on his shoulders, and he's got to deal with this and with the expectations of his family. And of course, by this time, you've got the beginning of the Camelot myth, which he inherits and has to deal with this just amazing set of expectations all his life. And in some ways, it crushed him. In the year before the Chappaquiddick accident, everybody was saying he's heading for a crack up. He can't stand the burden. But he persevered. I think that's the other great lesson of his life is persistence and perseverance.
Did, as I said, I'm not going to be chronological here, so you'll excuse me.
Keeps me on my toes.
Okay, let's talk just for a minute about Harvard. I mean, begin by telling us about the correspondence with his father about Harvard. I mean, does his father get the first letter of admission before Ted does?
Yes, I opened the book with an anecdote that I found here in the library. A letter from a dean at Harvard writing to Joseph Kennedy saying, glad to tell you that we've admitted Ted. And the same thing happened with the University of Virginia Law School. Either the letter was intercepted or it went to Joe, and then he then referred it to Ted. But it was not like Ted took the SATs and filled out the applications and asked mom and dad for a $50 check so they could enter the sweepstakes and get into Harvard. It was all done at that higher level. And one of the letters that they sent Joe said, while it's very rare to happen, every once in a while something happens to one of our students, either for character reasons or scholastic reasons, and we have to deal with it. If there's anything you know, tell us now, and we'll build some barriers around it. And it sounded to me like they were looking at his academic record, which was less than distinguished because he'd had a very cold childhood, and his parents had shipped him around to 9 different schools, including boarding school at the age of 7. So he was not the greatest scholar, and they seemed to be saying, okay, Joe, we're going to take Ted, but let's all realize from the start, please tell us if there's something we need to know. And then he got caught behind in his studies. He wanted desperately to play football because he loved it, but also because it was an expectation. And he got into a fix with a spring semester Spanish exam and got somebody else to take the exam for him. And they got caught, of course. And he was asked to leave Harvard, and he went and did a 2-year stint in the Army. It was tough duty. It was during the Korean War, and he was in charge of guarding NATO headquarters in Paris, where one of his greatest achievement was crowning Miss Shape.
Yeah. The story about the boarding school when he's sent away at 7.
They brought that back up. I mean, it was interesting. Lawrence Tribe said in his oral history that he would go down to Hyannisport and the party would begin rather casually, and then after a couple of drinks, Rose would get on Ted, you're too fat, or you were too sloppy, or your syntax was lousy on that speech. And Ted would say, oh, come on, Mom, you were terrible to me as a child. You put me off in boarding school when I was 7 years old. And it was a very lonely existence, and it was interrupted. By the time he came along, as she famously said to Time magazine, you're a little tired about reading stories and going out and teaching the kid how to sled. And he was basically ignored. He was asked by a University of Virginia professor about this, and he gave the professor a short story he had written somewhere in elementary school. And it's a little story about a boy who wants to run away from school, and he packs all his belongings in his little satchel, but as he's leaving school, the satchel opens up and all his belongings fall out and run down the hill. And strangely enough, there's a similar short story written by Richard M. Nixon about a little boy who tries to run away, and all his things fall out of his suitcase. So there must be a psychologist or a psychiatrist in the audience who would tell us what that particular dream means. But
the story of the boarding school is just so. I mean, when I was doing my research, it just. I mean, I shuddered. The kid is sent off from Florida to Bobby's school. What's the name of the school?
The Portsmouth Abbey.
And Bobby's how much older?
And
Bobby's,
there was nobody in that school who was at Ted's age.
Right. So Ted is 7.
It was like a junior high, and he was 7.
Ted is 7, and everybody else is 12, 13. And Ted arrives with his turtle, a pet turtle. Is that true?
His pet turtle. And the poor turtle dies.
And the doctor, yeah.
And the kids, to torture Ted, Ted has a little funeral for his turtle, and the kids dig it up, and they start throwing it around the dorm because, they're 15, they're 14, and Ted is being tortured. He gets it back, and sadly, but and another day in the schoolyard, he's getting beaten up, and Bobby walks by, and Teddy looks at him and says, family loyalty, bro, where are you? And Bobby says, it's a good lesson for you. You got to learn to stick up for yourself.
Yeah.
There were some cold moments in his life.
Whew. I mean, and it didn't for a long time. Go on.
Yeah, Maria Shriver was asked about this just recently.
Yeah.
About her upbringing with Eunice Shriver, and she said, "Well, I didn't get a lot of love and affection and hugs and kisses from my mother, but you can't give what you never got."
Hey, God. Well, but Joe was. I mean, Joe. People remarked about how Joe kissed his sons.
He was an amazing, as I know from reading your book, The Patriarch. He was an amazingly magnetic individual, and nowhere more so than in his family. His sons and daughters adored him, and they would do almost anything to win his favor. Even more so because he was in and out of the family. He would leave and go to the West Coast for 3 years to be a Hollywood tycoon, and then come back. Or he would stay in England as the U.S. ambassador while they stayed home. But he was always writing these letters to them, and they were writing back. And you can see that the bond was much warmer and deeper with the dad than it was with mom.
But one of the more remarkable things is that Jack says the same thing at some point when he's a kid about his mother. He says, you're not paying attention to us. You're always somewhere else. You went off on vacation. What kind of a mother are you? And Rose talks about that in her memoirs. I mean, that's how we learn this. And my friend, she died recently, Nancy Milford, the biographer of Edna St. Vincent Millay, and before that you're nodding your head. Who did she write about before?
Zelda?
What?
Did she write a biography of Zelda Fitzgerald?
Zelda Fitzgerald, right. She was going to do a Rose biography. And the reason she wanted to do it was that she saw Rose's funeral, and Ted, a grown man, was weeping. And she thought, if the senator, who's been through all of this and has maintained his composure, weeps when his mother dies, there's something going on there. I mean, Ted...
Not to dump on Rose.
Yeah.
But there was a very famous interview took place after JFK was killed, and Theodore White came to interview Jackie Kennedy. It was the one time that she spoke to a reporter for Life magazine, and it was the famous interview where the Camelot myth was launched. And she told Teddy White, before he went to bed at night, Jack liked to listen to the Camelot score and from the tales of King Arthur. And but in that was released, but in that interview, something was not released until several years ago. And that was Jackie talking about Rose. And she said to Theodore White, she never loved Jack. She loved being the wife of the ambassador, and she loved being the daughter of the mayor of Boston, but she never loved Jack. And then, just to make sure that he knew it, she said it again. She never loved Jack. And so this was a running sort of constant theme. And when it clashes so much with the image of the kids, playing touch football and sailing and with those big, beautiful Kennedy smiles, always looking happy, and there was a lot of joy. This was the thing that Ted tried to capture and maintain all his life, and Jackie herself said that among the brothers and sisters, other families were flat. This was like soda pop. It was effervescence all the time, and they played and worked off each other. But we never knew the Rose story, I think, until maybe 20 years ago, when Nigel Hamilton wrote that book about JFK.
The daughters always, when I wrote my book, the daughters were so, Eunice and Jean were so protective of Rose, and they would not have been as, they protested too much. And that Ted could grow up this warm, loving, compassionate, talk about him as a father.
He was a warm and compassionate father who tried to do as much as he could given the time restraints on him, which is what Ted Kennedy Jr. said.
Like his father.
Like his father, yeah. And he would try to get the kids to sit at the, Henry Kissinger would come for dinner, and they'd sit down to talk, and then Ted would say, well, here's my son Ted and my daughter Cara, and they're going to sit in with us, because he wanted them to see what his life was about, but also to get the benefit of the fact that the National Security Advisor or Secretary of State was sitting there at their dinner table. So he did try. He was very attached, especially to Patrick. But he had expectations of his children too. And one of the most poignant moments, I think, when he was dying, was he and Patrick went for a sail. And Patrick tells this story. And Ted finally, after all these years, turns to Patrick, who has built his own career in politics, and says, Patrick, after I'm gone, if you don't want to stay in politics, you don't have to. And sure enough, Patrick leaves politics. Yeah. So be careful what you wish for when you look at a family like the Kennedys and think, boy, life would be great if I was just one of them.
What's the Ted Jr. story when his father takes him skiing?
Well, that was another Patrick story. It was a great story Patrick told about being a member of the next generation, and they were skiing in Western Mass, and Patrick had a tumble, and trying to be a Kennedy, he was struggling to try to get up even though he had hurt his leg, and his father skied over and said, no, stay down, and he said, why, I can do it, Dad, no, stay down, and they got the ski patrol to come over and put him on a stretcher, and they took him down the mountain, and sure enough, they get down to the mountain, and by this time, every television camera in Western Massachusetts is there, and Patrick said, I had done my job, because now there was the newspapers and the press reported the next day that the Kennedys had been skiing in Massachusetts, and that Ted, the tender dad, had taken care of Patrick, who fell.
Let's talk a bit about the Senate career. The Lion of the Senate, 47 years?
It's fourth longest senator in American history. And but the thing about the Senate career, especially now, is worked with Nixon on cancer, worked with Reagan on arms control, worked with Bob Dole on voting rights, worked with Orrin Hatch on health care and AIDS, worked with Howard Baker on redistricting, worked with Everett Dirksen on civil rights. John McCain and Alan Simpson on immigration, and not just these guys who are thought of as moderates today. John McCain was anything but a moderate, so was Alan Simpson. But he also worked with people like Sam Brownback. And the ability to reach across the aisle is stunning in light of the situation today where we almost got these parliamentary parties that refuse to break ranks and do anything together.
Yeah. Were you at his funeral, at the funeral?
I was not. I was in the hospital myself at the time.
Okay. At the funeral, Orrin Hatch was one of the speakers, and Orrin Hatch got up, and he was, moved, and he told these wonderful stories about how he and Ted would, on the floor of the Senate, call each other all sorts of names. How could, my friend, Senator Hatch, be so obtuse and be so, oblivious to the rights of this and this, and Hatch would get up and say the same kind of insult from the other side. And then they'd go outside the Senate chambers, and on the way out, one would look at the other and say, "How'd I do today?" And the other would look and say, "You did just fine." And Hatch said, the fact that this Irish Catholic liberal from Boston and me, not a liberal, not an Irish Catholic, not from Boston, that we should be able to work together. He said, I thought at first that it was some sort of miracle, but then I realized that this is who Ted Kennedy was.
But there was thought that went into that. I mean, that brain of his was analyzing each one of these guys. What did Hugh Scott need back in Pennsylvania right after Watergate as a moderate Republican? Why Hugh Scott, the Republican leader, would come across the aisle and he would join with me on a campaign finance bill because the Republican Party in the Senate desperately needed this, and Hugh Scott in Pennsylvania desperately needed this. So analyzing each one of these senators and what their needs were was a very important part in putting together those countries. And they, by the way, that bill, and this is another lesson, that bill was hailed on, the campaign finance bill was hailed on the front page of the New York Times as the bill that would end the influence of big money interests in American politics forever.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court got a hold of that, and today we're in a position far worse than before Watergate.
Is there not a big Mormon church in Boston? Have I made that up? In Belmont?
Yeah.
I think the politics is true. I mean, that there were political alliances, and this was done to benefit both sides. But I also got the sense that Ted genuinely developed friendships across the aisle that contributed to this, that he was, he didn't look at Republicans as the enemy, who were always going to be over there. He looked at potential alliances and potential connections and potential partnerships.
These were real friendships. I mean, Alan Simpson left the Senate after working with on immigration with Ted Kennedy, but doing that Crossfire show or whatever that was called, where they yelled at each other for a minute every night on CNN. And he took over as head of the Institute of Politics, and he probably was over here a lot at the JFK Library, talking like we are. This was a true friendship. But don't look past the fact that when these guys walked into Kennedy's office, they'd better had their hand on their wallet, because he would take them over to the wall, and the office is recreated over at the Institute, and he would say, "Oh yeah, here's Jack, and we were doing this, and here's the coconut from PT 109, and here's the letter that my mom wrote me, and oh, look down there, there's Bobby and I, such and such," and even these massive egotists in the U.S. Senate would be enthralled by this and the idea that it was going to be the Kennedy Hatch Act, or it was going to be the Kassebaum-Kennedy Act. And they would go along. He had that ability to use that sort of Irish blarney to pull them in.
Yeah. He, when he came back after the accident, and when he came back after Chappaquiddick, did he have to start all over again? Building a reputation, building alliances?
Not so much after the accident. He came right back, and in fact, they gave him the Immigration Act, the 1965 Immigration Act, which changed the complexion of America radically and completely, and it has to be up there with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. Well, he held the hearings in the Judiciary Committee because James Eastland wanted nothing to do with it, but LBJ wanted it, so they had to find somebody to run the hearings. And Ted Kennedy sat there with his broken back, and then stood on the Senate floor and was the floor leader for that bill and saved it at a key moment. After Chappaquiddick, it was not a happy result, and it was something that was not really covered at the time, the rejection from his colleagues. They all said happy things and nice things about him to the press, but Robert Byrd began circulating among the members in the Democratic caucus and ambushed him and took away the whip's job. And then 30 or 40 years later, Walter Mondale, one of Ted Kennedy's closest allies, liberal allies, was asked about this, and he said, yeah, none of us could tolerate what had happened at Chappaquiddick. Chappaquiddick is what did him in. It wasn't just that, Bob Byrd ran this stealth campaign to do it. It was an amazing personal rejection from the Senate that hardly ever happens. So he had a lot of work in the years after Chappaquiddick to make his way back. And then he runs for president in 1979, in part because these same senators are coming to him and saying, Jimmy Carter is so weak, I'm going to lose my seat. And so that's one of the things that propels him into that race, which ended, as we know, quite badly.
You say on page 374, Edward M. Kennedy ran for president in the worst way.
Well, this is amazing because one of the things, again, I didn't realize until I got into the work was the element of self-sabotage in Ted Kennedy's life. The closer he got to the presidency, the worse he performed. And as he moved away from the presidency, the better he performed. He always thought he could not measure up to Jack and Bob, even while they were alive, much less after they became the martyrs and frozen forever in time as the charismatic young Kennedy brothers. And because he felt he could not measure up, many of his friends believed that whenever the possibility arose that he could be president, he was the one who destroyed the idea. And it happened here in Massachusetts. He was thinking about running for president, and they call up Roger Mudd, the CBS newsman, and he comes up here and he asks Ted ballpark questions. He asked me some tough ones, but he asked including the ballpark question, the softball question of why do you want to be president? Yeah. And Ted goes, and Ted Kennedy could be, if you ever were with him, could be very inarticulate. He was a great speech maker with a speech in front of him, but in this, he was not prepared. And the one thing that Ted Kennedy always did was prepare, because he was so insecure. He didn't prepare for Roger Mudd, and Warren Rudman, Anthony Lewis, Ellen Goodman, all turned that television off and said he doesn't want it, and he's trying to stop it before it gets started. Now, others will tell you that's psychological pap, but I really believe that there was a part of him which just said to himself over and over again, I'm not as good as Jack. Yeah. And I can no way meet the burden now that these guys are frozen in time as martyrs.
But he thought he was better than Carter.
He thought he was better than Carter, and he probably would have been a decent president. He knew how to assemble coalitions. He knew how to work the Hill. He had, for many years, the greatest staff on Capitol Hill. It was this hidden weapon. It was almost this hidden barony up on the Hill that represented liberalism. Everything went around it, Republicans and moderate Democrats. But there was, if you needed something and you were a liberal, you went to Kennedy's staff and Kennedy brought it to the boss, and they decided that, well, somebody's got to do it, and I guess it's going to be us.
Your discussion of the Carter-Kennedy, I mean, these appear to be two nice, smiling guys. They just hated one another, didn't they?
They did.
Is that too strong a word?
No, I would say loathe would be a good word. And you look at them and you say, you start to read it and you see the inevitable train wreck happening, and you say to yourself, "Now stop it." Yeah. You're the president of the United States. You don't need to be this petty, and you're a good man. You're a God-fearing guy who builds houses for Habitat for Humanity on weekends. And you look at Ted Kennedy and you say, "You're one of the smartest guys in the Senate. You know what's going to happen. You know you're going to give this election to Ronald Reagan. What's going on?" But the train wreck happened. This is actually it's an analogy from Pat Caddell, who was a pollster to both of them, he said he spent the 4 years of the Carter presidency trying to stop this inevitable train wreck from happening and failing, because he knew, and he told them all along, that this is going to be the only result was going to be President Ronald Reagan.
Did the only ones who, was the major reason his family and colleague, or his family gave to dissuade him from running?
Let me interject.
Oh, please.
There's a great anecdote about Jimmy Carter and his pettiness. So at the end of the convention, Carter has won. Ted is delayed in traffic, so he gets to the stage late. He walks up on stage. He walks over and he shakes Jimmy Carter's hand. And he walks over and he waves to the crowd. He comes back again and he shakes Jimmy Carter's hand. 5 times he shakes Jimmy Carter's hands. But he doesn't take Jimmy Carter's hand and raise it in the classic prize fighter's victory gesture. And the press jumps on this the next day. Myra McPherson for the Washington Post is the first one. And then it begins, as press stories do, to snowball. And it grows in Jimmy Carter's mind that Ted Kennedy refused to shake his hand. Yeah. And to this day, because it happened just 4 or 5 years ago, somebody asked him about that, and he said, it was reprehensible behavior. He was drunk, and he refused to shake my hand. And it's like, it's all over the videotape. There's 5 handshakes, but there's not the fighter's clinch.
What a guy.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No. I was going to ask, were members of the family were worried that he would be the third Kennedy assassinated?
They were, and he was too.
He was too.
Oh, absolutely. There are several instances where he let his guard down in those years after Robert was killed. And the threats were real. The Secret Service and the FBI file is this thick of crazy folks who were found in the bushes outside his house, or what's the name of the fellow that shot Reagan? I want to say Chapman. Hinckley. Chapman was John Lennon. Hinckley. Hinckley tailed Ted Kennedy around Washington for 2 or 3 days, including in the Senate office building, with a gun in his pocket before he went and shot Reagan.
But it's almost as if there were moments when he had a death wish. I was in Rome for the papal inauguration, was it the second one? There were 2 popes in a month.
That's right.
And Ted and Jimmy Breslin, Ted and Chris Dodd.
I know where this story is going.
Oh, well, tell me.
No, I'm just saying if it's Ted and Chris Dodd, there's a party somewhere.
Yeah. Well, Ted rented a scooter. And, Rome is not the place to ride a scooter unless you've lived there all your life. And he was drunk a good deal of the time. And, you looked at this man and you thought, he doesn't want to live. Or he's gambling. He's gambling. He's saying, if I stay alive after getting drunk and riding a scooter through the streets of Rome, then I deserve to be alive. Someone's saying, let him live.
Well, Patrick said that, that Ted believed that with each succeeding escapade that he emerged from with his political career intact, that he was more and more invulnerable. And there was a president of ABC News, David Burke, early in his career was Ted's administrative assistant. And he was analyzed it, and he said it was this way. Work, 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 work. If I'm working, nobody can criticize me. I'm doing the right thing. And so press the staff, study, prepare, work. And then, when it's time to play, play with the same vigor and because I can use it as an excuse that I'm tired from all the work that I did. And together, this sort of cycle takes you away from reflection about the loss of a mother's love or the loss of two brothers or whatever.
What about the drinking? Was that a...
Well, there's a lot of alcoholism in the family, and alcoholism can be a genetic thing. If you read Doris Kearns Goodwin's The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedy, it's striking how many of his ancestors were succumbed to alcoholism. So, who knows? But also, it was also self-medication. He was, from the time of that plane crash, he was in pain. In the 1980 campaign, the Secret Service guys felt so bad for him that standing giving a speech that they would surreptitiously take a chair and slip it behind him so he had something to lean on while he gave the speech.
He came to we invited him to the graduate center, the CUNY Graduate Center, at one point for a panel on, we were doing something on social welfare. And the head of security, the CUNY Graduate Center is on 5th Avenue and 34th Street, catty corner from the Empire State Building. And the head of security at the Graduate Center contacted his people over and over and over again and said, we'll let you in the back entrance, how many people are you bringing? And they said, no, he's coming by himself. One person is coming, and he'll come in the front door and leave by the front door, which frightened the head of security no end. He asked for only one thing. He said when he got there, he would need to lie down, right?
Yeah.
And he arrived through the front door, and we found an office for him to lie down for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And then he came out on stage, and the preparation was remarkable. He gave a speech, and then he answered questions from experts in social welfare from all over New York. And he answered every one. He knew the names, the numbers of every bill, where it was going, whether it would succeed. It was a remarkable performance.
And he also played the long game, which is that if he had a reversal on one of those bills, he knew that, all right, I got 23 votes this time. I can get 36 votes next year. And in 4 years from now, when the Senate flips, if we have a little bit of luck and there's a Democratic president, I can get enough votes to get cloture and defeat the filibuster. He was always thinking far ahead as well.
Was there a moment when he left, when he remarried, where his life changed, where the drinking changed, or you don't buy that?
Well, I think
Reformation
No, I think he
story?
got his drinking under control. He didn't stop drinking.
Yeah.
But it was more than, somebody was talking about Mitt Romney. It was more than just Vicky, although I think Vicky was really so important in making the last years of his life happy. But in 1994, he very well could have lost. He was coming off the Palm Beach scandal. Good friends like Charlie Pierce and Mike Barnacle roasting him. The Globe, for the first time, wrote an editorial which said, we've always winked at his private misbehavior, because it didn't affect the political, but in the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill clash that summer after Palm Beach, he might as well have put a paper bag over his head, because he was totally AWOL.
And we needed him.
And I've had the authors of the two major books about the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill clash tell me that if the Ted Kennedy that opposed Robert Bork a few years earlier had shown up that summer, then Clarence Thomas would not be on the United States Supreme Court. So that's an example of how the personal overlaps into the political and changes our lives. But anyway, the 1994 campaign, through a series of mishaps, including Palm Beach, by the time he got to September, running for re-election, he was down in the polls. Mitt Romney was ahead of him, and it was quite possible that he could lose. But the people of Massachusetts sort of had this feeling that they needed to take a 2x4 and give him a good thwack on the head, rather than really defeat him, because every time he began to lapse in the polls, the support came back, because they wanted him to learn a lesson, but they didn't necessarily want him to lose the election. And he ran a very cutthroat campaign against Romney with a very effective series of negative ads, and he pulled it out.
But not by a lot, right?
No, it was fairly respectable, yeah. Many years later, when he helped Mitt Romney push health care for all through the Massachusetts legislature, Romney had magnanimously invited Teddy to the bill signing, and it was at the same place where they had debated. And Romney I thought was one of the great political quips I've ever heard, walked up to the microphone and said, I feel like the Titanic revisiting the iceberg.
I visited, when I was doing my Patriarch book on his father, Ted was just extraordinary. I mean, I would ask a question to someone in his staff, and that evening he'd call me at 7 or 8 o'clock and just talk about his father. And those wonderful days, he was remembering what for him was that lost paradise with his brothers, watching movies, doing this, doing that. So I went to talk to him, and I guess it was on a Friday, and he said, come at 6 o'clock, we'll have dinner. And then I got a call from Vicky at 5:30. Ted's held up. And then at 6:30, Ted's held up. And then at 7, Ted's held up. And then finally, she said, come at 8. And I went at 8, and Ted walked in looking absolutely exhausted. And he introduced me to his driver and had one vodka, and sat down and was fuming at Reed because Harry Reid, because what Ted wanted, and this was just extraordinary, he wanted legislation passed that would give every municipality that received money, and I don't know exactly how it worked, that it would permit firemen to vote for whether they wanted to join a union or not. And Reed had promised, we'll do this, and then Reed had backed off. And Ted contacted firemen from all over the country and said, come to Washington. And he spent his Friday all day escorting firemen in their full regalia all over the Senate offices to introduce them. And that's why, this was a Friday, that's why he was so late, returning. And he was fuming because he couldn't understand why a Democrat, was not in support of that. he was a champion of lost causes as well
There's
as,
a really poignant
yeah.
appendix to that. And I believe that was the Friday before he went home.
Exactly. Well, I was going to
And
tell
was,
the rest of the
and was
story.
stricken by the brain
Yeah.
tumor. Yeah.
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 He was picked up the next day,
Yeah.
and he was telling me we have to get up early. We're going to Chappaquiddick. And he went and was stricken and taken into I guess he went right to the emergency room.
Yeah.
And about a week later, I think, the announcements had been made that he's going to be okay. And I had lunch with Jean, again, because they were helping me with my book. And I said to Jean, I'm so happy, you know. And she said, no. She said, no. She said, we're going to have to cut this lunch short because the family's going to make the announcement that it's terminal, they can't operate, that everything that's been said up to this point is not true.
Well, he showed amazing courage.
Didn't he?
And he when Obama was running against Hillary, Ted had endorsed Obama, and in doing so, sent a signal to the liberal wing of the party, but also to all the party professionals, that this guy was dependable, this guy was good, reliable. Yeah, you can go with him. And it was a great validation for Barack Obama's
And did he
campaign.
appear? He appeared and endorsed him?
He appeared with an endorsement. They rolled it out in typical Kennedy rollout. He did it maybe on Saturday, and then Caroline had a op-ed in the Sunday New York Times, and then on Monday they appeared, with Obama, and then he went out and he campaigned. This is that same spring, and then he suffers the brain tumor, but he's determined that he's going to speak at the Democratic convention in Denver, and he's already come close to death once because there was a pulmonary embolism that a nurse fortunately caught. But they put him on an airplane and they take him out to Denver, and along the way, all of a sudden, he's gripped by these awful pains. And the staff and the family is going, oh my God, this is awful. Well, it turns out that he had a kidney stone, probably from the chemotherapy medicine. So they take him to a hospital in Denver. And he said later, I saw every ologist that there was. And they diagnosed what it was, and they put him on this amazing morphine drip, and because he's insisting he's going to go talk at the convention. And he goes over to the convention, and he's meeting with Bob Shrum, who has written this intricately tailored speech because there was, is aphasia the correct word? He had a problem with some words because of the brain tumor. And Shrum had to tailor the speech around those words and consonants that Ted could use, and others that he had trouble with were taken out. It's a 15-minute speech, and they say, Ted says, I can't make it, they all say, you can't make it for 15 minutes, we got to cut this to 7 minutes. So he goes out on the stage at the Democratic National Convention, sick with a brain tumor, with a speech that he's never seen before. And remember, his code is prepare, prepare, prepare. No preparation whatsoever. And he guts it out. And he gives this 7-minute speech. And he ends it with a little reprisal, a little twist of on the dream indoors, and the fight goes on. 6 months later, when Obama is inaugurated, we see what might have happened at that moment, because at the inauguration, he has a seizure. And falls down, and it's all covered by the press. But characteristic of Ted, the next day, his call is to Joe Biden's kids, who happened to be there when he had the seizure, wanting to reassure them that he was okay, and that he didn't want them to feel bad because he had the stroke in front of him. He didn't want them scared. He was fine. This is what happens sometimes. And there's a million stories in the oral histories and people I talk to about Ted Kennedy calling in the middle of the night as they're on their way to their parents' funeral. Somebody's been sick. Somebody's pet dog has died. Somebody didn't get a promotion that they wanted, and the phone rings and says, "Hi, this is Ted. I just want you to know you can get through this." And they say they're so awed that he, who has endured so much, is calling them to cheer them up, that it makes a huge difference in their lives. Well, he knew that, and that was a gift that he would give over and over and over again.
Wow. I have like 6 more hours of questions, but we're going to open it up now. There are mics on either side. Just, if you have a question, let us hear it. But questions, please, not comments.
Hi, thank you. This is a question. It's going back to the Rose issue, but I just want to introduce it a little elliptically to show you where I'm coming from. My grandmother, my father's mother, also had 9 kids and was also very religious. I never knew her. She died long before I was born. But I have much older cousins because my father was one of the youngest. And one of them, not too long ago, on a Zoom, and he's a lovely guy, said, "I never saw my grandmother show any affection to anybody." And it hit me also through somebody else I know that there are women with 8 or 9 or 10 kids who don't really like kids. And is that really what we're saying about Rose, ultimately?
One of the things that Doris Kearns Goodwin writes is that, and she interviewed Rose for the book, was that her final conclusion was that there was a part of Rose that was exhausted from having 9 children, from being pregnant for 9 pregnancies. And there was a part of her, too, that being brought up in a strict Irish Catholic faith, was not as enthusiastic about sex as Joe was. Joe had, this is a speculation, but maybe you can tell me whether I'm right or wrong. Joe had the feeling that, if this is good enough for the Roosevelts and the Rockefellers, then why can't a Kennedy do it too? I'm rich and powerful too. I don't have to be bound by these silly conventions. And Rose dealt with it, as her children always famously said, by going to Paris, traveling and spending Joe's money on frocks and jewelry. So there was a lot going on there. Rather than, I don't mean to beat up on Rose. Ted did cry at her funeral. I mean, she was a mom. She gave them something along the way, which was very important, and that was the teachings of Matthew and Luke. That we're in this for the least of us, and to whom much is given, much is expected. So we shouldn't be dumping too much on Rose.
Okay, thank you.
The parents were so seldom in the same place at the same time that I told Ted exactly where he was conceived, because Joe was flying north, Rose was flying south. They met at a famous hotel in West Virginia.
The Greenbrier.
The Greenbrier. They were there for a couple of nights.
This is going in the paperback edition.
Okay. Then they went in their separate directions. And I said to Ted, I said, this is where it began. This is where you began. And because they were so seldom together, you could pinpoint it like that. A strange marriage.
Is it working now?
Yeah.
Okay. We have a question from an online attendee. I wonder what would have happened if Ted had spent the bulk of his career with 24-hour news channels. Would he have been able to cultivate those relationships?
He detested the Gingrich era. A lot of people will blame Newt Gingrich, who made the famous statement that the problem with Republicans is we haven't been nasty enough, and then took over the House of Representatives and displayed a breed of nastiness that spread from the House to the Senate, and was encouraged by the advent of Rush Limbaugh and by Nixon's old production manager, Roger Ailes, taking over Fox News and transforming the political climate. And that, of course, leads to today's knee-jerk, trigger-happy social media atmosphere, behavior that in many ways has the political leaders. Well, first of all, they have to raise so much money that they're on the phone all the time with donors. But the last thing they want is to be able to go home and find out that Fox News or Rush Limbaugh, before he died, had whipped up the base against them, and that is like against the Ted Kennedy rules of politics. He would have found, I think, some way to deal with it. He was a smart guy, and he would have had smart guys around. But when it started, and those acolytes started going over from the House to the Senate and changed the Senate from this great historic, the world's greatest deliberative body, to the snake pit that it is today, he didn't like it at all, and he lost a big one. He put together an amazing coalition for immigration reform with Lindsey Graham and Barack Obama, and Lindsey Graham stood up there and said, we have a deal, and I'm telling you, if this deal doesn't pass, it's never going to happen again. And it was a deal that would have capped the borders and yet given amnesty to the people who were still here, let the dreamers stay. It was a great package, and Ted had a disagreement with Harry Reid, who refused to keep the Senate in. There was a recess coming up. The Republican senators went back, and Limbaugh and the others whipped up the base, and the Republicans came back and said, we got to back out of it. And the Democrats, not to blame it all on the Republicans, Democrats said, fine, we want the issue. Anyway, we'd rather take this and win the Hispanic vote. But he came that close to a comprehensive solution to the immigration bill. And that was at a time when Gingrich acolytes like Lindsey Graham were beginning to appear in the Senate, and he managed to get them to come along.
I always kind of felt that Ted Kennedy's faith was a little bit like his being from Boston, the whole family being from Boston, or their faith was kind of used for their political gains. But actually, when his daughter was suffering from cancer, he went to the Mission Hill Church and prayed. Was faith important to him, and was it a genuine part of his life?
The greatest remark that I've heard about faith and the Kennedy boys, you look at them and you say, okay, so, how possibly could they have been devout Catholics where sex out of marriage is a mortal sin, and still, as Jack Kennedy was said to have done, knelt at his bedside and said his prayers at night. And the British ambassador, who was a close friend of his at the time when he was president, went to Jack and said, there's an inconsistency here. And Jack said, well, yeah, we can break the rules, but it's important not to lose the basis of our faith. Because in times of crisis, in times of trouble, it's a great thing to fall back on. And if you reject it entirely, then you don't have that. It was a very transactional way of they would be what's called now cafeteria Catholics, people who picked and chose from the dogma. But there was never any doubt that that teaching of Luke, to whom much is given, much is expected, and the Beatitudes, the Sermons on the Mount from Matthew, were true guiding parts of Ted Kennedy's life. Now, he had a period after Bobby was killed where he says that he was devastated and he despaired. But later in his life, he came back to religion, and it was important to him, possibly because Vicky came from a religious Catholic family from Louisiana. And together they rediscovered his faith, and it was a comfort to him at the end.
They learned a lot from their father, too, about how to get away with breaking the rules. During my research, I went to Austin, Texas, where I think I'm the only person who did research in the LBJ Library and the Gloria Swanson papers, which are in the Harry Ransom, very close. And Gloria Swanson had her ex-husband, who she had married again write her biography and was asked to tape her reminiscences. Never got into the book, but there's her letters, handwritten letters. And she said, you know, Joe had it all figured out. He said he'd do whatever he wanted to do, and then on Sunday he'd go to confession. And he said it was like, for the rest of us, like washing our hands. He'd go to confession, having washed his hands, he'd come right back and visit me again. And she said, I'm the fool because I put up with it.
Mr. Farrell, you've written 4 biographies, one about Clarence Darrow, a man that you obviously never met and weren't alive when he was alive. You've also written one about Richard Nixon, a man whom I presume you never met, but have memories of as a person growing up. You've also written about Tip O'Neill, a man I presume that you did know personally and professionally, and also now, most recently, your book about Ted Kennedy, a man I also presume, with your work with the Globe, knew personally and professionally. And I was wondering, what challenges are there, or how is it different when you're writing about someone that you knew personally versus when you're writing about someone that you've never met and weren't alive when that person was alive, and writing about someone that you didn't know and never met, but you were alive when they were alive, if there is any difference?
No. First off, it's much easier to do a book when everybody's dead. And I'm going to make a confession tonight, and I've got some editors, former editors here in the audience tonight, and my sister who might challenge this, but I am basically a very shy person. And the hardest thing for me as a newspaper reporter was to ask prying questions. It got to the point at one point in my career where I had a hard time actually picking up the phone and making phone calls. I had to do it in person because it was the only way I could absolve myself. So to ask really difficult questions for me it was a professional hurdle that I had to get over. And asking, talking to Patrick about his dad, talking to Vicki about her husband, those are really tough things. It's much easier to go and do Clarence Darrow and read old newspapers about his stirring speech in the courtroom. There was a big problem with the 3 Irishmen. Nixon was Irish. We forget that but he was Irish. With the 2 Irish Catholics, there was this reticence of lack of self-reflection and no self-analysis for the public whatsoever. Even if you did manage to do it in private, you never talked about it in public. Nixon was always saying, don't put me on the couch, and then immediately going into realms of self-analysis and psychological. So he was a very easy one to capture a personality. Ted was very hard, and Ron Powers did a great job as the ghost on the memoirs, and Vicki did a great job prodding him to go further and further. And here's a story as well. When I heard that he was going to do his memoirs, this was before he got sick, I sent him a note. I was out and about. I had left the Globe, and I said, if you need a ghost, I would be honored. I'm volunteering for the job. I had written the book on Tip O'Neill. I knew Boston. I thought I was a good candidate. And I said, but, just so we know from the start, I'm really going to push you hard because it's not going to be a good book unless you talk about stuff that people want to know. And he wrote me back a nice note saying, well, we've decided to go in another direction. But Ron and Vicki managed to get out of him, arduously, I understand, some measure of self-reflection, which really makes that memoir special and actually gives me a basis for my analysis of his personality, his feelings of inadequacy. And this doesn't come to Jack's brain from Zeus. This is from reading a lot of the oral histories and from reading especially his memoirs and his oral histories.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have a question from a virtual guest from Dublin. Is it known what Ted's favorite part about his trip to Ireland was?
He made many trips to Ireland. I know he was there right before the Good Friday Agreement, and that was a great matter of pride and a great matter of effort for many, many years on his behalf, solving the problem with Northern Ireland. And of course, his sister, the ambassador, who everybody thought was going to be a nobody, and turned out to be the hidden gem in that story. There was another time that he went to Ireland in 1970, I believe it was, 70 or 71, and he gave the Edmund Burke Lecture at Trinity College. And it's an amazing speech because it speaks out at, I mean, talk about the now and Gingrich and reaching across the aisle. In 1970, he makes this speech and he says, you know, we've just gone through the 60s, but a life of slow and relentless progress and reform is superior to the flame of a radical movement that burns out. And that was a great speech as far as what his political tactics and strategy were. But the most poignant visit to Ireland that I know of was on his way home after JFK was assassinated the following spring. Ted had two duties. One was he was chosen to be because he was the happy-go-lucky guy. He didn't have any feelings. He was the lightweight. He was chosen to be the one who met with Earl Warren and go through the details of the assassination of JFK. Something that Patrick told me never left Ted, was akin to post-traumatic stress disorder, because all his life, constant references in the media about the murder of a brother. And the other thing he did that spring was he had to go overseas to raise money for this place. And he went to a lot of places. On his way, he stopped in Ireland. And on a sunny day in Limerick, 100,000 people came out. And they welcomed him. And he gave a speech. And when JFK had visited Ireland and left, he said, "I'll be back in the springtime." And Ted ended his speech by saying, my brother was here, he said he'd be back in the springtime. Well, there will be no more springtimes, and he won't be coming back. Very amazingly poignant moment. I'm getting choked up just talking about it now. Yeah. But there was a true feeling of love for Ireland, and it most clearly manifested itself in the Northern Ireland issue.
Before he passed away that August, if I remember correctly, the captain of USS Constitution allowed him to go to the helm, which I think would be a great honor because he was just about gone as it was. What I'd like to know is that as he was going through all of these trials and tribulations with this brain tumor, and they wheeled him onto the floor for a vote. This man had to have some of the most amazing courage and integrity to be able to go through what he did. And I've studied a little bit about it, but where did this come from after all of this horror that his entire family went through?
Yeah. It was the horror that led to that, because he felt this compelling need to honor Jack and Bob's memories, and later on the other family members that he lost. He was torn apart when JFK Jr. Died, and he had to go and supervise the moving of the remains and then the funeral. But it was this, I believe it was this absolutely compelling need. I mean, any one of us might have said, forget it. I'm the last male in the family. There's assassins hanging out in the bushes and tailing me around, the capital. I'm going to go to the Mediterranean and sail. I'm going to get behind the wheel of a big sailing boat and go up the coast of California like I did when I was a kid. But he didn't. He stayed with it because he could do no other thing. And I think that when he got sick, that same drive took over on an overall spiritual level, but also because he saw that Obama was in and he had gotten Obama to give him this promise that he would do health care. And he worked at health care, and he enlisted he got all the different interests in a room together, and they hammered out a bill they could all live with. And when Obama was sworn in, they gave it to Obama. And Obama felt this obligation, so that after the bill was passed, after Ted had died, Obama went to a party, and then he went back up to the quarters of the White House, and he said, I thought of two things. I thought of my mom, who had died of breast cancer, and I thought of Ted Kennedy.
Thank you.
Sure.
What made Senator Kennedy's staff so excellent, and what does that kind of share for inspiring excellent public service and a next generation of service today?
JFK and the New Frontier had just an astonishing effect on a whole generation. And every bright young kid who was interested in politics wanted to go to Washington, if you had a liberal bent or Democratic Party background, and go to work for the Kennedys, the Kennedy White House, the New Frontier. When Ted then took over the mantle, and Bobby had been killed, they all wanted to work for Ted. And so he had, summa cum laude, Harvard Law guys going to be taking $20,000 a year jobs as committee investigators. And he had Dave Burke, who he got from the Kennedy White House to be his chief of staff, who would then later go on to be the president of ABC. I mean, these were really top-notch people. He had some people that stayed with him all their lives and all his life. Guys like Carrie Parker, who was a brilliant strategist and speechwriter and reader of the Senate floor. If Kennedy had an alter ego in the Senate, it was Carrie. But it was also a place where you joined in a fraternity, this great web of contacts that still exists. AOC is probably the latest one to talk about her days in the mailroom in the Kennedy office. And they're all, if they had a flaw, it was arrogance, because they were cocky, young, smart people. And Ted had a way every once in a while of bringing them down to earth. And he would say, I wish I could have a speech as good as my brother has. Or he'd say to an aide, I don't need these mistakes. I'm quite good enough, as you've seen, making them myself. And then this Harvard graduate would be in tears, and Dave Burke would have to put his arm around him and walk him around 3 or 4 times around the Senate office building and calm him down. But the next day, Teddy would be a smiling boss. Hey, how you doing? And maybe he'd say, I'm sorry. But, if you had to go home for a funeral of your uncle, there'd be a phone call at the funeral home, and it'd be Ted Kennedy asking to talk to your aunt. And it was that kind of dedication. It was a two-way relationship.
We have another virtual question. Did you get the senator's widow to cooperate in your biography of her husband?
Yes and no. Vicki was extraordinarily gracious in talking to me, but not helpful in meeting my requests for example, Ted Kennedy's diary. It's sitting here somewhere in what they call courtesy storage. In his entire life, he would talk into a tape recorder after meeting with a president or after a Senate debate, and it would be sent to somebody to transcribe. And I knew it was there because when I was doing my Ted Kennedy, my Tip O'Neill book, I interviewed Ted about old Kennedy O'Neill stories. And it was explained to me that somebody had been sent here to look through the files, find the diary entries, and send a briefing book down to Ted, because Ted he was very conscious about history, and he wanted to be accurate, and he wanted to tell it the right way, according to him. So he would have this briefing book. Well, what would happen is occasionally, instead of packing it up safely and sending it back to the vaults here, somebody would slip it into a folder, especially if it was material for a speech. And then they would slip the diary entries into a speechwriter's folder. And I found that by pluck and luck, by going through the different files in the National Archives and some here, you could find segments of the diary from Vietnam, from the confirmation with Alito, and Judge Roberts about confirmation to the Supreme Court, and several other things, the Bangladesh, which we're celebrating this week. So it was skullduggery that was taught to me by some of the people in this room, who would be embarrassed if I was to mention their name, Steve Kirchen. But it worked out well, but Vicki did not choose to share that, perhaps because there's not a unanimous feeling in the family about what to do with them yet. I'm furious at the United States Congress for the piddling amount of money that they give the archivists here, and so the process is so slow on processing Ted Kennedy's Senate papers. So, you know, in about 20 or 30 years, which is about usually the gap between great biographies of somebody, somebody's going to actually write a biography that's close to definitive. But as helpful as Vicki was, she did not supply that stuff to me, and eventually somebody will get it and write one hell of a book. Or maybe they'll publish it as Ted Kennedy's diary, and it'll sell 1 million copies.
Last question?
Sure.
Please.
You've mentioned Patrick several times, and it strikes me that in the same way in which Ted perhaps felt freed in not pursuing the presidency further to be able to focus his efforts in making a difference in the Senate, that he in many ways granted Patrick that same freedom in encouraging him or pointing out he didn't have to stay in elected office. And sure enough, he likewise has become arguably even more of a national leader on mental health and addiction issues. And given that there's so much greater appreciation for those in the wake of the pandemic, curious as to your take, having connected with him, on the opportunity for him to build on that and continue that legacy of his father's and his in advancing those concerns.
Well, the two of their lives has sort of followed a track with, you know, Patrick had great political success as a representative, despite the fact that he came from a famous father, a famous family, and a dynamic father, just as Ted did. But in both cases, there was instances of substance abuse problems and personal crises. With Patrick coming in a later generation, there were drug issues, which he candidly explains. But there was also working hard during the day to make his dad proud of him, just like Ted did. And then there's a crisis, and in Patrick's case, he leaves public office. Ted stayed in public office, but he finds a new life with a family away from the turmoil that had existed before, and seems to be doing well. And he picks up, you know, an option that was always open to Ted, because it was done by Jean and Eunice, which was, you know, you don't have to you don't have to run for office to make great improvements to make gentle the life of the world, as Ted and Bobby used to say. You can do it by inventing the Special Olympics, and Patrick seems to be doing that right now with mental health, as you said.
I want to thank Jack for an extraordinary interview and an even better book. So go buy the book. And I want to thank the audience. You've been great. As an old college professor, I always look to see how many people head for the hills or that door, and how many people sort of nod off. And you did neither, so congratulations, thank you. And thank you also to our audience, our virtual audience, wherever they are. Thanks again, and good night.